All right, so we have a few Ask the Pastor questions. Number one here, and I have them in my notes, but I also have the actual papers so that I can do something fun. What is your favorite verse? Wham, that's the fun. So this is always a hard question for me because I don't have a favorite verse anymore. When I was first a believer, I had all right, this verse, man, I love that verse. And I don't remember what it was anymore. But there was a verse I really grabbed a hold of. What's that? Something like that. Yeah, probably. One of those kind of nice verses. But now really it's when people ask me that, I'm like, well, whatever verse I need at the moment, And I'll go through phases in my Christian, recently in the past few years, God will give me a verse that I'll hold on to for a while. And it'll be all right, I'm fighting with this verse, and I need this verse. And then some other challenge will come up, and then I'm like, Lord, that verse isn't helping me anymore. Give me another one. Then he gives me a different one. I'm like, yeah, that's the one. Lately, the one I've really been holding on to is Matthew 16:18, where Jesus tells Peter, on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Just thinking of the universal church. The church is in decline in America right now, and all throughout the world, the church is in really rough state, and our world is just weird and kind of crazy, and getting crazier, it feels like. And so when you look at that, it can get depressing, and you can feel like, man, the church is just dying, and hell is winning, and evil is triumphing. And then you look at our church, and we're small, and it can feel like, boy, what are we against all the darkness and all the evil in the world and injustice in the world today? And it can feel like we're not going anywhere, we're losing the battle. Well, Jesus said he's building his church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And so we can trust in what he said. Despite what our eyes might see, we know he is building his church. And it doesn't come down to just me or just Brian or any one of you guys. Yeah, we all help. We do our part in building this local church and in building the universal church, spreading the good news wherever we go. We do our part, but ultimately it's up to Jesus. It's his church. He will build his church, and we can trust him to do that. Amen. All right, so that's the one I've been holding on to lately. But I don't have a single, that's my favorite verse anymore. There's a lot of good verses, and my favorite is the one that I need right now, basically. All right, question 2. How do we find a highway to heaven? Yeah, I don't know. I didn't quite understand that. How do we find the highway to heaven? So Brian's remark on that was, well, isn't it a highway to hell? And I don't feel like we want to find that one. So how do we find the highway to heaven? How do we get to heaven? Stairway, there's a stairway to heaven. That was also what Brian said next, yeah. Are you guys married? You should really look into that. Do you mean how do we get to heaven? Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So the way to heaven is Jesus. And he said, Matthew 7:7-8 says, ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and it will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks it will be open. So, Jesus is the key no matter what. And if you need to know how to get to heaven, you go through Jesus. And if you're like, well, I'm not sure how to go through Jesus, well, ask, seek, and knock. It'll be open. You'll find. Just go to Jesus, and boom, you get heaven. It's all good. Yeah?
Just realize what the answer is.
Oh, yeah?
Really, praise is the highway.
Praise is the highway. Oh, man. This is a little, it's hard for me now. There's a lot of worship songs that are wonderful. That one has always bothered me. But Brian deserves to do that to me because I played Oceans this morning. And he can't stand Oceans. And he had to play bass for it. I saw you struggling though. I don't. Is the person who wrote that question about the highway to heaven? Are you here and you want to clarify what you meant, or you're here and you like seeing me suffer, or you're too embarrassed to admit you wrote?
Watching on YouTube.
Yeah, they're like, I'll wait till later. All right, question 3. And it says here, Pastor Jake. So this one is specifically for me. Brian, you're not allowed to answer this. And you will find out why. I think you know why. Who of all the Schuler boys is your favorite? Now, this is an interesting question because there's a lot I could say about this. There's a lot to choose from. So, similar to the verse, the one I need at the moment. No. I told Brian that I was going to say, well, I dislike you all the same. No, I like all of the Schuler boys. Sometimes. Sometimes I don't. No, I love you guys. But, okay, so this is an interesting question because at first when I read it, I thought, I bet one of the Schuler boys wrote this, and they want to get me in trouble, or they want to be like, see, I knew I was his favorite. But
Can you see the handwriting on it?
I don't have to see the handwriting. I can see the misspelling of Schuler. It's Schuler. There's a C in there, the Schuler boys. And so given that fact, I don't know any Schuler boys, so I can't answer that question. Thank you, Jesus.
So, kids, who's my favorite kid? The one who brings me Culvers. There you go.
Oh, there we go. There we go.
I didn't say the last one. I just said whoever did.
All right, now we got two questions that are on a similar topic, and these are going to take the rest of the day. And yeah, all right, ready? Okay, so these are related to women. Women are one of my two favorite genders. I told Brian I wanted the women questions, and he goes, that's Jake, always grabbing the... No, you didn't say that. That sounds really bad. Jake always grabbing the women. Of course you want the women or something like that. What not? No, all right, so these questions, let me get to the questions. Can you explain, this is question 1, in case you didn't figure that out, because it was the first one I'm saying. Can you explain the role of women in the church? And in parentheses, especially as leaders, teachers, prophets, evangelists, and pastors. That is a very easy question to answer. Yes. All right. Shoot, Paul, can you get the paper for me? I'll come back to that, don't worry. All right, then the second question, I'm just going to say both the questions first. Second question is, how are women saved in childbearing? And that can go there. Oh, this one can, there's other questions on this one, so we'll save that for Brian for later. All right, so how are women saved in childbearing? And what is the role of women in the church, leaders, prophets, pastors, evangelists, all that kind of stuff? Well, I am gonna start with the second question first. How are women saved in childbearing? Because then that will help lead into the first question of the role of women in the church. This is actually, I like this topic. It's interesting to me for a lot of reasons. Not because I like looking at what God forbids women from doing or the restrictions that are placed on women. I like this because it's interesting to me. There's a lot of the topic of women in ministry. So there's a lot of overwhelming evidence that Jesus and the church lifted women up from their position in society, and it's very like pro-woman, if I can say that. In Greek and Roman society, and even in a lot of the Hebrew society, women were viewed as less than men, as inferior to men, as even like there were some comments made like the development of their brains is worse than even a small child and things like that the Greeks, the Romans, and some of the Hebrew writers would say, like really disparaging things about women, and Jesus wasn't that way. Jesus allowed women to come and listen to him and allowed women to be a part of the ministry. And yet, with that, then you would assume, so it's like a free-for-all, men, women, there's no difference, do whatever you want. But no, women, Jesus and the church and the Bible really do lift up women, and yet there are restrictions. There are some very clear things where it's like, okay, women aren't allowed to do that. Women aren't in that. Men can do that, but women no. And then you could flip it around and say, well, there's things with men too. Like, no matter what the media says, men still can't get pregnant. So too bad. If you want to get pregnant, you got to be a woman. And then some of these restrictions, so it's also interesting to me, because some of these restrictions placed on women in the church are very clear. To me anyway, I think they seem very clear. And yet, despite that, people get really passionate about fighting against that and resisting that. And they come up with all these theories and reasons why that doesn't mean what it says it means. And so that's interesting. You know, I'm like, that's something I kind of want to figure more out about. And then also there are some key verses about women in ministry and women in the church that are really some of the most confusing, difficult to understand verses in the entire Bible. Like, the Bible has some things that are really easy to understand, and there's other things that are like, what is going on there? Some of the weirdest, most difficult to understand verses in the Bible deal with women in the church. And so you have people across the spectrum having different ideas of that. And so that all of that makes it like a topic that I go, this is interesting. I want to know more about this. So this last week, I read a bunch of articles, read a lot of Bible verses, listened to a lot of teaching on the topic of women in the church, and heard from stuff and read stuff that I agreed with, other stuff I didn't agree with. And I have my head just full of way too much stuff now. So hopefully I will share stuff that you walk away and go, oh, that's useful. And you won't just be overwhelmed and go, why did the guy in the grizzly bear shirt share that? Hopefully you'll have something that you can take with you that's good. All right, so how are women saved in childbearing? First, this comes from, well, raise your hand first if you've heard this verse before or heard this concept before. So there's some of you who have never heard this. That's not unusual. Brian was actually just telling me this week, he talked with the pastor about this. I think it was Brian. And the pastor was like, I've never heard that. Where's that from? And so it's not unusual. It's kind of one of those obscure verses that it's easy to, as you read the Bible, you just go, what? And then you go to the next one. So it comes from 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15. Paul is writing to his disciple Timothy, and in the midst of this discussion about women, well, at the end of this discussion about women, he says this statement, yet she, referring to women, will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control. I apologize, I don't have scriptures up on the PowerPoint. Like I said, it's been a tangled kind of morning, so I didn't get to that yet. But Greg, if you're on the ball, you might catch a few of these and can whip them up there. So 1 Timothy 2:15, yet she will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control. All right, so raise your hand if you know exactly what that means. Daniel's like, I'm putting that way down there. Yeah, it's confusing. You're not alone. Paul, could you get me some water? Thank you, my good man. All right. So whenever I come to a confusing Bible verse, what I try to do then is I step back and I go, okay, what is the context of this? Who's speaking? Who are they speaking to? And what's around this verse? What's the book about? What's the letter about? What? So that I can kind of get a frame of reference to then go on, all right, where does this weird verse fit into the whole scheme, and then maybe figure out what's going on. Thanks. So who wrote 1 Timothy? Paul. And who's he writing to? Timothy. So Paul, the apostle, is writing to his disciple Timothy, and the point of 1 Timothy, so Paul wrote this letter to him, and the main point of it is to give him instruction on how the church should function, how to lead the church. Timothy was in Ephesus at the time, and so Paul is writing to him just saying, hey, I'm giving you encouragement and instruction how to organize stuff at the church, what church life should look like. And actually, 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 14, Paul basically says he states the reason of his letter. He says, I hope to come to you soon, but I am writing these things to you so that if I delay, you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, a pillar and buttress of the truth. So he's got Timothy over there in Ephesus. Paul is not in Ephesus, and Paul is hoping to come visit and help organize the church, get things figured out, and instruct everybody. But just in case it's going to take him a while, he thinks, let me write a letter to Timothy, because he's over there, and Timothy can try to, pass on some of the stuff ahead of time, work through some of these things. And so most of 1 Timothy, not most, but a lot of 1 Timothy is just, this is how the church should look, and tell people this, teach them how to do that. And so then when we get to 1 Timothy chapter 2, the beginning of 1 Timothy chapter 2, it starts out Paul instructing people on how to pray. And he's talking about pray for your political leaders, which was a really good admonition, because they had a lot of corrupt, evil, just straight up evil political leaders. And so he tells them, pray for your leaders. And then after that, then he shifts into this discussion of women and how women should behave in the church. And then after that, then he leads into the qualifications of elders and deacons, and what you should be looking for people that are going to be elders and deacons. And so this verse then, it comes in the midst of this discussion of what church life should look like and how people should behave in the church. Men, women, elders, deacons, everybody, how we should act in the church. And so let's read the women's section here. 1 Timothy 2, starting in verse 8. And if you have your Bibles, you can open them. But I am going to go through a lot of different verses and stuff throughout it. But you can go to 1 Timothy 2, 8, and that's a good place to start anyway. And if you need a Bible, there's some Bibles in the back there. So 1 Timothy 2, verse 8, I desire then that in every place the men should pray, lifting holy hands without anger or quarreling. And now he's going to shift into the discussion about women. Likewise also, that women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel, with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair in gold or pearls or costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness with good works. So he starts the discussion about women basically saying, rather than, I want to encourage the women to not be so focused on how they look on the outside, on on having expensive hairdos, on getting expensive clothing, expensive jewelry, on impressing everybody with what you look like on the outside. But instead, what would be better is to focus on internal things, focus on self-control, godliness, good works. I don't think Paul here is condemning that, having braids in your hair. Uh-oh, Jesse's got braids in her hair. At the time, in Greek and Roman society, women, I don't know this because I don't know this by personal experience. I wasn't alive back then, but I read some commentaries this past week where they're talking about the elaborate braids and elaborate hairstyles that the Greek and Roman women would have, and they would spend hours to have people professionally do their hair, like every day, especially the wealthy women. And they would put a show. They would make a show of their external appearance with their hair, their clothing, their jewelry, similar to what women nowadays do as well. We were missionaries in Romania, and especially over there, the women worked really hard to look good on the outside. And so Paul, I don't think he's saying braids are bad, jewelry is bad, name brand clothing is bad. What I think he's saying, though, is, hey, in this culture, in your society, women focus way too much on, you've seen all their braided hair, and they're way too focused on that. It's an idol. Some of their clothing is an idol. Some of the jewelry is an idol. And so what he's saying is shift your focus, shift your priority. It's not the specifics of braids are from the devil. It's the heart, okay? So in our culture, I think actually a woman with braided hair is more, well, that's kind of something simple. You don't look at her braids and go, whoa, you're trying to impress everybody, aren't you? So in our culture, maybe it would be walking around with extra tight jeans or with a low-cut blouse or something like that. And you'd say, okay, the principles are you want to be modest and you don't want to draw attention to yourself. You don't want to emphasize. Like your focus should be inside, building yourself up on the inside, growing toward God and maturing toward God on the inside, not trying to draw attention from everybody else, especially in the church. If you can imagine, you come to church and you're trying to worship God and you're like, man, her hairstyle is amazing. Whoa, look at that guy's mohawk. That's awesome. Whoa, I love his tattoos. And you're like looking around at what everybody's looking like instead of worshiping God. I think that's kind of the point of what he's saying here is like, look, the priority is the heart. So it's not the specific outer things, but whatever is causing a distraction, whatever might be an idol, whatever is a waste of time or money, don't do that. Focus on what really matters. Does that make sense? All right. It was funny. Well, there are churches. Romania, I loved Romania. I loved being a missionary over there. But we learned a lot about, there were really good things in how the churches were done over there and how the Christians lived, but there were also a lot of really hypocritical, overly religious, legalistic type things. And so there were a lot of churches over there where if a woman came in with earrings, everybody looks and they're like, oh, she's going to hell. And yet, the woman would leave, and then she puts earrings on, and that's all okay. And everybody's like, oh, it's fine as long as you're not at church. Like, that's not the point. Okay. All right. Then we get to verse 11. Let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control. Now, if you're more confused after reading the context, it's okay. All right, let's go into this. All right, there's a lot here, and I'm going to go. You're going to be like, would you just get to the answering the question? I will, don't worry. But I'm going to go through this a little bit slowly because then this helps answer the women in ministry question later on, building a framework. All right, so he starts out with some kind of radical statements here. Let a woman learn quietly. She is to remain quiet. So what's the deal with that? What does it mean to be quiet? Why is he telling the women to be quiet? And to make it worse, maybe your version of the Bible, to make it worse, make it more difficult, your version of the Bible, your translation might actually say, let the women learn in silence and remain silent. Yeah, that's what yours says? I heard you. Silence. Yeah, there's some versions that say that women have to be silent. And again, in our experience in Romania, there were churches, especially in the countryside, very traditional churches that say, well, it says the women need to be silent, and so at church, the women are not allowed to talk. And if a woman starts talking, everybody assumes, ooh, she is in major sin. And they'll go on shh. Men can talk, but the women no. That's what some of the churches do. And so they take it very literally. Well, it doesn't make sense that Paul would be telling the women in the church to be completely silent. Why doesn't that make sense? Well, because Paul himself encouraged women to speak at church. 1 Corinthians 14:26, Paul says, when you gather together, each one, he doesn't say just the men, but he says each one has a hymn, a lesson, a revelation, a word in tongues, or an interpretation of tongues to share. He encourages the whole church in Corinth, when you come together, everybody come to share something. And he doesn't provide a qualifier. No, I mean just the men, guys. He says everyone, men, women, children, everybody has something to share. So it doesn't mean that women have to be totally silent. That doesn't make sense. Also, in 1 Corinthians 11, he tells women to pray. And he tells women to prophesy. And we have examples of women speaking in the Bible amongst believers in the church situation. So that doesn't make sense, that we should expect women to be utterly silent at church. All right, so we throw that out. So what does quiet mean? It's interesting. There's a number of words in Greek that are translated quiet. One of them means to not speak. That word is not used here. The word that's used here is hesukia, which I probably pronounced all wrong, but I'm going for it anyway. It doesn't mean to be inaudible. It means to have a spirit of stillness, to have a heart of quiet, to be calm, to simmer down, to be relaxed. It's not about your words. It's not about not speaking words. It means be chill, be relaxed, be calm, have a spirit of quietness around you. It's the same word that he used actually in verse 2 of this chapter, just a few verses previously, where he's encouraging people to pray. And he says, to pray that you may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. It's about just being calm and relaxed and quiet. You're at peace. Everything's okay. It's not about that women come into the door and now you can't talk anymore. It's about having a quiet heart, being at peace. Which, let me ask you guys. So Paul calls out the women here and says the women should be quiet. The women should learn in quiet. The women should be at peace at church. Now, would Paul say the opposite to the men? That you can be chaotic and disorderly at church? No. Why does he specifically say talk about the women here? I don't know. Maybe because the women in Ephesus were known to be chatty, or maybe Timothy asked him about that. I don't know. But he wouldn't say the opposite to the men. He wouldn't say, hey, men, come on in and be as loud as you want. So Brian's showing me a meme that really needs to be shared. It's a picture of, you need to get that to Greg to put it on the big screen. All right, we'll come back to the meme in a moment. It's about stillness. But if I say what's on there or show it up here, it's going to ruin it. So, you could read these verses and you could be like, well, Paul has no right to tell me I got to be quiet and still and relaxed at church. Well, everyone has to be relaxed and quiet and still at church. So, simmer down. Be relaxed, honey. Chill out. It's okay. We all need to be quiet and respectful at church. All right, we in America, we lived overseas for a while. Many of you have traveled overseas, and there is a bad stereotype of the ugly American tourist, that they're loud, they're obnoxious, they share their opinions all the time, and they're pushy. And having lived overseas for 5 years and seeing Americans come in, yeah, they are very loud. And they can be pushy, and they can act like they know everything. And so it's sort of true, but not entirely true. So there's this stereotype of Americans being very loud and boisterous all the time. Well, the Bible encourages people throughout the scriptures to have a spirit of quietness, a spirit of stillness about them. Proverbs, 2 different times in Proverbs, it talks about the foolish woman, and it describes the foolish woman as loud, clamorous, boisterous. So there is this connection to, the Bible does encourage having a quiet heart, a spirit of stillness. Isaiah 42 about Jesus says, he will not cry aloud or lift up his voice or make it heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, and a faintly burning wick he will not quench. In 1 Thessalonians 4:11, Paul says that we should aspire to live quietly and to mind your own affairs and to work with your hands. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 12. He says, such persons we command and encourage in the Lord Jesus Christ to do their work quietly and to earn their own living. The Bible really does encourage men and women to just be chill, be calm, be relaxed. And especially if you imagine in a church gathering, it doesn't help anybody if anybody's being all super loud and boisterous and trying to draw attention to themselves. It's about Jesus. We're here for him. And so here in 1 Timothy, he points out, make sure the women are calm and relaxed and that they're not just getting all loud and obnoxious. Greg, you got the meme? Not yet. All right, well, maybe we'll share it afterwards. All right, then the next thing, not only does he tell the women, hey, you got to be quiet, then he brings up something about teaching that could be offensive if you want to take it that way. He tells them they can learn quietly, that it's okay for women to learn, which is actually a pretty radical thing for him to state at the time, because in that culture, women were not allowed to learn. They couldn't go to the schools. And so Jesus allowed the women to come and learn, and then Paul is continuing in that tradition. Let them learn. It's good for the women to learn. But then he says, I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. And then he repeats something similar in 1 Corinthians 14, verse 34, about not allowing women to have authority and to speak, to teach. How does it go? Shoot. Well, something similar there, but now I'm forgetting what exactly the verse was about. My head is full of random verses right now. But not my favorite one, because I can't remember my favorite verse. So, does Paul have a problem with women teaching? Would Paul get all offended if, you handed him a book by a woman author and he'd be like, what the heck is this? Heresy, women aren't allowed to teach. Or Jesse has taught a couple times here. Annie has taught here. Jesse teaches the women's meeting. Would Paul, if he heard that Jesse had a women's meeting and was teaching them, would he be all like, that's not good. Women aren't allowed to teach. Or most of the women here have homeschooled their kids, and so that requires teaching. You're teaching the kids. All of my kids know how to read and do math because my wife taught them how to read and do math. And any other thing they know, well, half of it's from her, half of it's from me. So was Paul offended by the fact that women are teaching? Is that the issue here, that he doesn't want women to teach, or is there something else going on? I don't think he has a problem with the teaching itself, because he does. Titus 2, he encourages older women to teach the younger women how to behave in the home. And so there's encouragement for them to teach there. Also, women are encouraged to teach their children and to raise their children well, which requires some teaching. However, counterpart to that, there's a lot more verses that tell the men to teach your kids. So guys, you don't get to just blow it off and go, yeah, my wife will figure that out. The guys are told more often, maybe because God knows the guys will blow it off if they're not told. And then Priscilla, there's the story of Priscilla and Aquila, where they encounter Apollos in Acts 18. In verse 26, it says that Priscilla, along with her husband, explained to him the way of God more accurately. Apollos was preaching. He's kind of a big shot. And yet God chose a woman with her husband, but he puts her name first to go and explain to him the way of God, the gospel, more accurately. So I don't think Paul and I don't think God has a problem with a woman teaching. I don't think that's the issue here. In Proverbs 31, verse 26, too, this verse is great. It's in Proverbs 31, full of great verses of encouragement to a woman to figure out, to see, okay, this is a picture of a godly woman. Verse 26 says, she opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. So I don't think God or Paul have a problem with the teaching itself. The main issue seems to be to teach or exercise authority over a man. It seems to be the having authority over men in the church. That's the issue here. He doesn't want women to run the church. And you can be upset about that. You can argue about it, whatever. But it seems that the evidence is clear that for some reason, God does not want the women running the church, exercising, having authority over the men in the church. He wants men to run the church. Now, the question, what's that? Amen. And a women. So, Paul forbids women from running the church. And it'd be easy, I could just say that for the second question. I could be like, well, the question on women's role in the ministry. I'm like, well, you can't run the church, so there you go. Then it's easy enough. I could say that. It's in the Bible, so there you go. But I always go, well, why? Why? A woman could run a restaurant, and she could kick butt at that, and does amazing. There's women that are running countries, and some of them do great. Some of them are New Zealand. And so that's just what it is. Some are running states, and some do great. Some don't do great. So, So why, though, why could women not run the church? Why does God not want a woman to have authority over the church? Maybe some of you have wondered that as well. And so some of the suggestions are, some people have said, well, Paul is saying this because it was not culturally acceptable at that time in their society. And if they wanted people to come to church, and if guys would come to the church and see a woman pastor, they would have been like, well, I'm not joining this movement. And so Paul, because he was so concerned about how people felt, and he was such a man pleaser, that, that he said, no women, guys, I would love to let you lead, but I can't. Guys won't come. No, Paul didn't care about cultural norms. He's confronting them constantly. Others say Paul himself was a bigot. He was just an old barbarian who wasn't enlightened like we are, and so Paul didn't get it. No, that doesn't make sense, because God had trusted Paul to build his church, and he entrusted Paul to write scriptures and give us instructions on how the church should function. So why would God choose someone that was less enlightened and just didn't get it? That doesn't make sense. Why would God allow some barbarian bigot to put a barbaric, bigoted viewpoint in there? He would have scratched that out somehow. He would have put it in Paul's mind, yeah, that's not a good thing, don't put that in there. And then he wouldn't put it in there, because God knew what he wanted in the scriptures. So that doesn't make sense, that it was just Paul's personality and he was flawed. Or, the other option is maybe Paul is getting at some truth here that's beyond culture, that there is something real that God is trying to communicate through the fact that men lead the church, not women. All right, so let's go to verse 13 then. Paul tries to explain this, why he doesn't want women to exercise authority over men in the church. And why does he say teach or exercise authority over men? So one of the principal jobs of the elders who do have authority over the church is to teach. And so I think that's why there's the combination there, that it's not the teaching in particular, but it's the teaching in authority over the church. So now he provides some evidence. He backs up his claim that is not that ruling the church is for the men, not for the women. Verse 13, for Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. All right, that totally clears it up, doesn't it? No, now it's even muddier. I'm like, well, what does that have to do with Adam and Eve? Because a woman nowadays is not Eve. Eve was Eve, and a woman nowadays is nowadays. And a man nowadays is not Adam. That's two different things. And so what does he mean by this? But before we go look at what that means, there is something important in the fact that so when Paul wants to back up his claim to the fact that women should not lead the church, women should not rule in the church, he doesn't say, because this is culturally not acceptable. Or because I've just noticed it doesn't work out well, or because women's brains are smaller. No, he says because look at Genesis, look at the foundation, look at the beginning. So he traces it back to this is something God established, so that's something important we got to keep in mind. And also, this is something that's irrelevant of culture. Cultures change, generations change, expectations of cultural roles, that will adjust through the years. But Adam and Eve and their story, that doesn't change. It is what it is. And so he builds his case based on something that is in the Word of God. It comes from God, and it's irrelevant of culture. So he's not concerned about culture. He's concerned about being faithful to what the Word of God says. But what does he mean by that? What does he mean about bringing up the whole story of Adam and Eve and bringing sin into the world and Eve being deceived? Adam wasn't deceived, but Eve was, and then she led him into sin and all that. Why does he bring that up? And people have different thoughts about that. Some say, well, he's trying to let the women in Ephesus know, he's trying to let Timothy know that women are more easily deceived than men are. Women just don't have the intellect to figure things out. That doesn't make sense at all. Because then why would he encourage women to prophesy? If they're more easily deceived, shut your mouth. You don't think you heard from God. If they're more easily deceived, they're not going to be hearing from God. They're hearing from wrong spirits. So why would you want them to prophesy? And why would he encourage the women, the easily deceived women, to teach the young women who are easily deceived? Why would you take those who are easily deceived and have them teach the people who are most easily deceived? That'd be the worst situation of all. He'd tell the men, he'd be like, guys, you're going to have to teach the women because these women are so deceived they can't teach anybody else. And you know how they are. No, so I don't think he's making a general statement that all women are more easily deceived. And I've heard people say that, and I think, well, that's kind of insulting to women. I don't think he's saying that. Another suggestion is that Paul is saying that because Eve was deceived in sin and brought sin into the world, she's more guilty than Adam. And so one of the punishments of her guilt is that she doesn't get to lead in the church, that Adam gets to lead now. That doesn't make sense either because, well, ultimately, they both screwed up. They both allowed sin into the world. And if anybody should take more of the blame, I would say it's Adam, because Adam was not deceived. Eve was deceived. And if you're deceived and you sin, it's like, well, you didn't understand it right. You got confused. Okay, you're still guilty for sinning, but I get it. You got deceived. Adam, it doesn't say he was deceived. Adam knew what he was doing, and he sinned anyway. So that seems worse to me. And then Adam was supposed to care for her and protect her. Where was he? When that snake started talking to her, was Adam like, oh, yeah, cool, you got a boyfriend over there? Seems like a nice guy. Like, come on, go talk to your wife and help her. Stand in between her and the snake. What's your problem? So if anybody was more guilty, I think it's Adam. And if anybody, so if this is related to the guilt and the original punishment there, Adam should take more of the blame than Eve should, in my mind. So I don't think it's about that either. So what is he talking about? Well, I think he's pointing at the fact that he's bringing up this story, and he's saying, all right, God made Adam first, and then Eve. And he's saying, there's a reason for that. God is trying to communicate something in this. He didn't make Eve first. If God could have made both at the same time if he wanted to. He could have made Eve first if he wanted to. But instead, he could have started making Adam, and then while he was just like halfway done, then he starts making Eve, whatever. But he made Adam first. There's a reason in that. And then he made Eve after that. He's trying to communicate a universal truth in that. God is communicating a universal truth that Adam representing men, Eve representing women. So Adam was called principally to lead, and Eve was principally called from the beginning to follow. And so the role of men is principally to lead, and the role of women is principally to follow. And in the church is supposed to represent that. Where am I going here? All right, so, and then why does he bring up the whole story of Genesis and Eve being deceived, taking the fruit, getting it to Adam, Adam takes the fruit, sin comes into the world. I don't think he's trying to heap more guilt on women or men there. I think he's just saying, look, this is what happened, but Adam was created first, and he was created to lead. Eve came second out of Adam, and she was created to follow. Had Adam led and Eve followed, Eve would not have eaten the fruit. But instead, Eve decided to stop following Adam's lead, and she went and did her own thing, took the fruit, and then Adam, instead of leading his wife, said, yeah, I'll just follow her. So they flipped it around. And what he's trying to say, he's not trying to make a judgment call on who's more to blame or anything like that, or, well, this is your punishment for that. He's trying to just say, this is what happened, that God made them in this correct order, that she was supposed to follow Adam, but she didn't follow Adam. Adam was supposed to lead, but he didn't lead. But instead, she went and led, and Adam followed her. But if you can imagine, if she would have actually followed Adam, and Adam would have led her, we wouldn't be in this place. And now you could argue, well, Adam would have taken the fruit himself and led his wife into it. Yeah, that's possible, but that's not what happened. What happened is Eve went for the fruit, and Adam followed her. So I think he's just showing, look, this is what happened, but if they would have done it God's way, it wouldn't have been screwed up. And so he's trying to say, do it God's way. God made an order for a reason. The men should lead, the women should follow. In the home, in the church, that's how it should be. So just do it the way God set it up to be. All right, is that making sense?
Too easy, huh?
Too easy. All right, so why though? Why did God choose men to lead? Obviously, we're so much more talented. No. Jennifer's like rolling her eyes. She's like, have you seen the state of the world with men leading? It's not because of some inherent qualities in men, and God's like, you guys would be way more equipped to lead the church. Maybe some men, yes, but you could see some women where you say, man, you could do a pretty good job leading, but no. I think the principal reason, if you look in Greek, the word for man and the word for husband are the same. There is no different word from what I could find. The word for woman and wife, they're the same word. And so there's a connection there. It's not just about men should lead, women should follow, which is kind of a universal base thing that the Bible teaches, but it's about family. It's about husbands lead at home, wives should follow. He's trying to build, and then in the church, the reason that men lead and rule the church versus women is because that's supposed to be a testimony of the established order in the family, that people look at the church and they see, godly men are leading. Interesting, and godly men lead in the home. And women are following at church. Women follow in the home. It should be a testimony that points to how the proper order in the family, and it should be a testimony of the proper order in the universal church. You see the order in the local church, men leading, women are following, and then you go to the universal church, the bridegroom leads, he's the head, we, the bride, we follow. So it's supposed to be this testimony, this witness pointing at a deeper truth. And then another level, it should point toward the order in creation, that God is our father. It doesn't say he's a mother. There are a couple times where the Bible metaphorically gives God female attributes, but the overwhelming majority of descriptions of God are as a father. Jesus refers to God as the Father over and over and over. And so people should look at the church, the local church, and they see, these godly men are leading, and these godly women are following. And that should point to the order in creation, that God is our Father, and we are supposed to follow him. Does that make sense? So why does he say men lead in the church and women follow? To point toward godly order in your family, to point toward godly order in the universal church, and to point toward godly order in all creation, that we're all created to follow God, to submit to him. But we all are like Eve. We all want to be the leader and tell God to follow us. And then and society gets more and more like that, it seems. All right, so let's read these again, these verses about the women here. Let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control. All right, so now we get to the main question. What does that mean, that the woman will be saved through childbearing? Well, first, the word childbearing in Greek, it has implications beyond just birthing a child. It's about birthing a child, raising a child into adulthood. Some versions of the Bible, some translations actually say child rearing here versus childbearing to show that distinction, that it's not about just popping on a new baby, but raising that baby up to be a godly human being. But what does this mean? There are some churches, and again, we met some in Romania, some very traditional churches that told women, your only purpose in life is to get married and have a baby, and then have as many babies as you possibly can. And if you don't have enough babies, you might not get to heaven. And so we met people that were freaking out about that because they're like, I've only had 7 kids. Do you think that's enough? It's like, I think it's about you have a relationship with Jesus and you trust him. It's not about how many babies you have. But there are churches that will teach this that way. So I think there are probably before I go to that, not only does that idea that women, that you're saved through having babies, and the more babies you have, the more secure your salvation is, not only does that just not line up with the fact that you're saved by faith, but also Paul encourages unmarried women, stay unmarried and just serve God. But if you can't control yourself, then get married. So, he doesn't elsewhere make this distinction that you have to get married and have lots of babies. So he can't, to be consistent, it can't mean that. It can't mean that you're saved by having babies. So there's 2 possibilities that I encountered that seem to make some sense to me. One is, so Paul just discussed Adam and Eve and their fall into sin. And one of the punishments that came on them was that God said that Eve would have pain in childbearing. And so it could be that Paul is basically saying, look, that happened, she sinned, and one of the punishments is that she'd have pain in childbearing, but I want you to know, hey, you women, you still can get saved. You're not still guilty, you're not bound forever you're not thrown out of the kingdom of God just because Eve was, sinned and was punished as a result of that you can be saved despite the pain in childbearing, despite the punishment that you received, that Eve received. You can still be saved if you continue in faith and faith, love, and holiness with self-control. So it could be that he's encouraging and saying, you can still get saved. Don't worry about it. I know Eve screwed up, but you can still be saved despite the screw up. The answer that made the most sense to me that I'm leaning toward is that maybe Paul is using the word saved here in a way that doesn't mean in a way that means work out your own salvation. Like sanctification. He might be saying, he might be using it the same way in 1 Timothy chapter 4. He tells Timothy to take heed to your teaching, and in doing that, you will save yourself and your hearers. Does that mean that when Timothy would preach, that just because they heard his words, that boom, they're saved because Timothy is in charge of their salvation? No, that doesn't make sense. But that through his preaching, people who hear it will know how to follow God better, and they'll be sanctified. And he himself, as he's studying and preparing sermons and listening to his own sermons, that he himself will be more sanctified because he's learning how to follow God better. So it could be that Paul is using the word saved here in that sense, that through childbearing, through child rearing, through raising a family, that there's something about that will lead to a woman's sanctification. I think this makes a lot of sense. Especially those of you who've had kids, men or women, it sanctifies you, or it drives you nuts. One or the other. So I think what Paul is saying is like, hey, you want to be godly? Here's a quick route to that. You women, get married to a godly man, start having kids, and you're going to be tested, you're going to be pushed, you're going to have to surrender stuff, you're going to have to sacrifice yourself, you're going to have some times of anguish where you're crying out to God, but it's going to make you more holy. You're going to learn to be selfless. You're going to learn to be humble. You're going to learn to trust God like you've never trusted him before. And so I think that's what he's saying here, that you're going to be sanctified through this act of raising a family. And he really does. The Bible encourages, and Paul as well, he encourages women, like, look, you want to do the best in life. It's not about becoming some powerful CEO. It's not about being the best missionary, the best leader in the church. That's fine stuff. But you want the best in life. The best in life is if you raise a family, because no longer will you just, like, let's say a woman decides, I want to be a pastor. I want to be a missionary. Okay, well, that's cool. She's a missionary. What if instead she says, I'm going to raise a godly family. I'm going to have as many kids as I can, and I'm going to pour myself into those kids. I'm going to train them and teach them, and then they're going to grow up, and one day you're not going to just be you're one lone missionary, but you've got 6, 7, 12 missionary kids that you've raised up that are bringing the kingdom of God all over the place, or 3 or 4, however many kids you have. And so, so you see Paul many times encouraging women, this is a great route to go. Our society goes the opposite. Our society poo-poos women staying at home and raising up kids and training them to follow after God. And our society says, oh no, you're not using your gifts, you're not using your talents, you're not being who you were created to be. Instead, you should be a high-powered CEO. You should wear pantsuits because that looks so cool and everybody's going to respect you then. And you should have whatever. They want women to leave the home and find their calling somewhere else. But the Bible encourages the opposite. It says you want the best for you is stay in a home, raise a family. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 14. So I would have younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, and give the adversary no occasion for slander. This is the best. You want the best? Okay, you're married, your husband dies. You want something good? Get married again and raise a family again. So otherwise the enemy's going to come in and have an opportunity to seduce you and lead you down a path that you don't want to go. Titus chapter 2, verse 3 says, older women likewise are to be reverent in behavior, not slanderers or slaves to much wine. They are to teach what is good, and so train the young women to love their husbands and children, to be self-controlled, pure, working at home, kind, and submissive to their own husbands, that the word of God may not be reviled. The typical best plan, in Paul's opinion and in my opinion, for a woman is find a godly man, get married to him, or let a godly man find you because you are worth a godly man seeking you out. You shouldn't have to go hunt around to find him. Trust God to bring a godly man to your path, and if he's good enough for you, he's going to find you. And get married, have kids, raise those kids to love God and follow their destinies, and just enjoy life as a mother and a wife. Amen. All right. So where do we go here? Got to check my notes. I have way too many notes. And the longer I've been alive, I remember as a college kid hearing all the feminist stuff, and I thought that seemed to be like liberating to women. And it's like, yeah, why shouldn't women be, I don't know, CEOs or astronauts or politicians or whatever they want to be? Why should they be stuck at home having to take care of the kids? That seems really barbaric and old-fashioned. And so you're in college and you're hearing all the feminist stuff, and I'm like, yeah, that made sense. But the older I get and the more I follow Jesus, the more I study the Bible, the more destructive the feminist ideology appears. it leads to nothing. It leads to hollowness, hurt, bitterness, anger. You go work a job, and you're mistreated over there. You're abused over there. Men take advantage of you. You feel terrible, and then you're just on the treadmill, the rat race, trying to climb the ladder, and it's not helpful to women. It's not helpful to men. It tears families apart, destroys our society. It's no good at all. And then you look at the biblical alternative. It's like there's peace, there's joy, there's love. It sounds fun. Moms can be moms. Wives can be wives. They can raise their kids. They can bless their kids, bless their husbands, and they can chill and see their kids rise up and take over the world for Jesus. That's way more fun, way more fulfilling in the long run. So, amen. All right. Woo! All the men are like, I want to be a mom. No. Better not. All right. So now I got to move from there to, all right, does that make sense for the first question on women saved in childbearing? Cool. All right, sweet. I like that answer. Okay, so women's roles in the church, and I've got a few minutes left here. But that's all good framework toward then the next question, what are women's roles in the church? So let me ask you a couple hypothetical questions to think about. If the best, highest calling, according to the scriptures, for a woman is to raise godly families, what do you think the ideal role for a woman would be in the church family then? In the church body, in the local church? Now, here's another hypothetical question, or a question to ponder, I guess, not really hypothetical. If Paul didn't want women running the church and exercising authority over the men in the church, because the local church is meant to be a testimony of order in the family, order in the universal church, and order in all of creation, what do you think the ideal role for women would be in the local church? All right. So, as you ponder those, or maybe you're done pondering, and then you can listen to me. There are a few places in the New Testament that put some restrictions on women in the church. They seem to fall into 4 different categories as I was looking at the different places. Number 1, there's restrictions that apply both to men and women, like simmer down at church, be relaxed at church, that 1 Timothy 2 talked about. Dress in modesty, that would apply to men as well. If we have all these men coming in and like bare-chested men and all that, maybe that would be offensive to everybody here. Nobody wants to see that. So there's some of the restrictions that apply to men and women. And then the second category is there's restrictions that are culture-based. 1 Corinthians 11 about head coverings, I believe, is that. I did way too much reading on head coverings this past week. It was way more interesting than I expected, actually. But that seems to be a cultural thing where in the Greek culture, in Corinth, women, to show submission to their husbands, would wear head coverings. And so then Paul's saying, look, for you Corinthians, the women, you better wear head coverings to show submission. Because if you're not, that's going to be disruptive. It's going to be a distraction. And it's just going to create all sorts of problems. And your husbands are going to be mad. And it's just not going to work out well. So there are some restrictions that seem to be very culturally based. Some churches would say women need to wear head coverings at church nowadays. Romania has a lot of churches like that. And there are some cultures where women do wear head coverings in culture, and it's a show of respect. Outside the church, they still wear head coverings in a show of respect to their husbands. And so if that's the case in the culture, yeah, wear head coverings. If your culture, the women don't wear head coverings, then don't wear head coverings at church. So there are some that are cultural-based restrictions on women. And then the third category is restrictions where he's dealing with a very unique, specific situation in the church. And so he gives a restriction on the women in the church for that scenario, in that instance. 1 Corinthians 14 is that, where Paul is talking about women. He's talking about the order of the church service and people speaking in tongues and people prophesying. And he's talking about, look, let 2 or 3 prophesy at most. And if someone's going to speak in tongues, let there be an interpretation. Let there be order here. And then he said, if the women have a question, let them sit quiet and ask their husbands at home. And so it seems like in that church there was some situation where the women were spouting up in the middle of the service going, he said sanctification. Hey, honey, what's that mean? And like some commentarians said that, and I don't know if it was true or not, but they said that the men were on one side, the women were on the other. So if you can imagine You know, you got the women over here, the men over there, the preacher's preaching something, and the woman goes, hey, honey, what's that all about? And they're just going back and forth, and maybe you got some guy speaking in tongues over here, another one prophesying over there, and then someone saying, no, I didn't prophesy that, no, I don't mean that, and then you got all this chaos, and so he's saying, hey, you guys have disorder and chaos, you don't make any sense, nobody's getting blessed by what you're doing, so, all right, if you're going to speak in tongues, just make sure someone can interpret it. If you're going to prophesy, one or two or three at most, keep it in order, and elders should judge. Women, you got questions, ask at home. So there's some restrictions that seem to be dealing with a specific situation in the church, and Paul is giving advice. This is how you can deal with that. We can still find principles out of that, like women, ask your husbands at home. The principle there is don't disrupt the church service with your question, which we've had some people do that sometimes, and had to tell them, look, we'll talk about that later on. Then the fourth level seem to be restrictions like 1 Timothy 2 talked about, women not running the church, restrictions that are based back in the story of Adam and Eve. God made Adam first and then Eve. Restrictions that are meant to maintain the church, the local church, as a testimony of the proper order in the family, the universal church, and all of creation. So those seem to be the four different categories of restrictions placed on women. So given these restrictions and the questions I asked you to ponder previously, what roles would you say are probably off limits for women in the church, local church? What do you guys think? Any thoughts, or you're too scared to say? Or I'm being confusing. So if women are not supposed to run the church, and if there are that's the main restriction that's given on women in the church. And then there's some restrictions that are specific instances, like women interrupting the service. If there's cultural-based things, like women should wear head coverings, that doesn't apply anymore. If there's restrictions for men and women, like dressing in modesty and all that, what roles in the church, in church ministry, do you think women are not allowed to participate in? So what roles would that be, running the church? What's that? Deacon. So there's some debate about deacon. Anybody else? Pastor. So it's basically pastor, elder, apostle, possibly deacon. Deacon, I'm leaning toward off limits the more I've been studying it, but there's some debate on that, which I can come to. So if those are the off-limits roles, what else can women do in the church? Everything. Everything else. Every stinking other thing you want to do. You can heal the sick. You can raise the dead. You can teach a Bible study. You can lead a prayer meeting. You can clean the church. You can do children's ministry. You can do the youth group. You can do an outreach. You can do evangelism. Whatever. If it's not being an elder pastor, not being an apostle, not being a deacon, which that's a possibility, you're good to go. Do what you want. But just to drive, not to beat a dead horse, but to emphasize this a little more, because our culture is so egalitarian, and they don't like looking at differences between men and women and all that. Just to emphasize it a little bit, there is no place in the scriptures for women to have governmental authority in the church. And we could see the evidence from Jesus on down the line. Jesus had 12 apostles to be the foundation of the church. None of them were women. He had women that he highly respected and said amazing things about. He allowed them to follow along in the ministry, and they ministered to him and they ministered around him. And yet he chose none of these women to be apostles. That seems to send a message. And I don't think the message is that Jesus cared about what his culture thought, and that the people at the time were just old-fashioned and they couldn't deal with women to have leadership over the church. If he cared about what society thought about his disciples, would he have picked a tax collector to be one of his disciples? No, he wouldn't have done that. He doesn't care what society thinks. He cares what God thinks. And so he chose only men to be the apostles. None of the New Testament apostles were women. There are, outside of the 12 apostles, there are, I forgot how many, Do you remember, Michael, how many apostles were named? About 26, I think. About 26. So they're all named, and none of them were women. There's one, if you look this up, if you go on Google and you're like, were they really all men? Well, some places you'll find they'll say someone named Junia is named as an apostle, and that's a woman. Well, that does seem to be a woman's name. There is question on whether that is an apostle. You look at what's said about them, and it doesn't, I don't think so. The evidence is very, very poor, and you got twisted a little bit. Other people say Phoebe, too, that Phoebe was an apostle. Well, that evidence is worse than with Junia, I think. Nowhere does it say Junia, the apostle, or Phoebe, an apostle. No, it just has some words that people go, oh, that seems like that would be an apostle. Doesn't say an apostle. None of the New Testament elders were women that we know of. And the Greek word that's used for elder, it has a male and a female form. The only one that's used in the New Testament is the male form. It's like if you were to go to a restaurant, you have waiters and waitresses, right? One means male, one means female. Well, they had, for elders, they had a male and a female version, elder, overseer. But only the male one is ever used. And so there may have been no New Testament deacons that were women. We know that there were men that were deacons. There's one woman, Phoebe, who's called a deaconess, basically. But the word for deaconess is the same word for servant. And so does this mean that she had an official position as a deacon, a female deacon in the church? Or does it mean that she was just one of many servants and people who served in the church? I could be convinced either way. I'm leaning more toward, though, that she was just a servant in the church, because when they picked the 7 deacons, they were men. And so it seems like that one of those would have been a woman if the message, if the Bible wanted to say women could be deacons as well. But I could be convinced the other way. I might be willing to budge, because deacons have delegated authority from the elders. They don't have governmental authority over the church. They have authority. The elders have said, okay, you can have authority to run this thing, the coffee bar, or the prayer ministry, the youth group, whatever. They can run a certain thing in the church, certain ministry in the church, but they wouldn't be running the church. And so I could go, that's debatable. All right. So also, elders and deacons are said that both, though, say that they have to be husband of one wife. Something very difficult for a woman to do, to be a husband. And then Paul in 1 Timothy 2, he talked about that he doesn't permit a woman to teach in authority over men. So the Bible seems pretty clear. The role of running the church is for men. Again, because it's supposed to be a testimony of the order in your family, the order in the universal church, and the order in all of creation itself. All right. Okay. But women, also, the Bible is very clear that women can minister as well as men. Jesus had women followers, and I'm not going to read these verses, but I remember the first time reading in Luke 8 about the women that would follow along with Jesus and minister to him and minister with him. The first time I realized that there were women ministering with him, I was like, wait, what? Like, I just had this perception that all Jesus had was his 12 disciples, and that was it. But there were crowds following him, and among the crowds, there were some very faithful women. But I remember the first time seeing that and going, that's pretty cool, especially in that culture at that time where that was not really acceptable. And Jesus was like, no, you can all come to me. Some of Jesus's followers, some of the women followers were, they stuck with him through the crucifixion. When all the men ran off, except for John, the women stuck with him, and the Bible makes a point of noting that. Jesus spoke very highly of women on many occasions and made it clear that they were a blessing and that they could minister. He called Mary, he said that she has chosen the good part because she wasn't just in the background serving, but that she came to minister directly to him. Priscilla, I mentioned her earlier, along with her husband Aquila, they ministered to Apollos and taught Apollos the gospel, the way of God, better than he understood before. Phoebe was highly active in ministry with Paul. Let me read this. Romans 16, verses 1 and 2. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a servant of the church at Cenchrea, that you may welcome her in the Lord in a way worthy of the saints, and help her in whatever she may need from you. For she has been a patron of many and of myself as well. That word patron there, that's the word where some people take that and they say, that means she's an apostle. No, she's a patron. And the word in Greek, it means someone who blesses someone else and cares for someone else. Lydia, in Acts 16, she was a businesswoman who was the catalyst for the church in Philippi, and seems like she may have hosted the church in Philippi in her home. Paul calls Junia a kinsman and fellow prisoner. Philip had 4 daughters who prophesied. Paul talks about Euodia and Syntyche. He says that they have labored side by side with me in the gospel. They are my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life. Mark's mother held a prayer meeting in her home. Nympha hosted a church in her house. Paul tells the Romans in Romans 16:6, he says that Mary has worked hard for you. So women are shown to be examples of faith, dedication, many times throughout the New Testament, and you can go back to the Old Testament, like Ruth, Hannah, the mother of Samuel, Esther. Then you got the New Testament, Mary, Martha, Mary of Bethany, Mary Magdalene, Elizabeth, John the Baptist's mother, Anna the prophetess. Over and over and over again, the Bible shows that women are awesome, women can serve, women can minister, but there's one thing that you're not allowed to do. You can't run the church. All right, let's move on. Let's just wrap up. Okay. So, can and should women do ministry in the church? What do you guys think?
Yes.
Yes. All right. Can women run the church? No. Isn't that amazing? For you women, isn't that amazing? You can have all the fun and none of the responsibility. You could pray for the sick. You could raise the dead. You could cast out demons. You could teach. You could pass out tracts. You could organize an event. You could have so much fun just serving Jesus, and you don't have to have the pressure of being a pastor.
Awesome.
That's awesome. I was listening to Steve Gregg this week on this topic, and he's like, I don't understand why women want to be pastors. He's like, they have whole ministries that are dedicated to, let's try to get women in ministry. Let's try to get women being pastors, women running the church. He's like, it's a pain. It's the worst thing ever. He's like, if I don't want to be a pastor, it's hard. It is a pain. It's very difficult. I just want to have fun, minister, teach, bless people, come in, do what I want to do, and get out and let somebody else clean up the problem and deal with it. You guys get to do that. Don't just make problems for us, though. We don't like problems. Brian and I are not fans of problems, so keep the problems to a minimum. But that's it. You can have fun. You can serve God. You can minister in every way you can think of, but you just can't. He's decided in his infinite mercy and love of you that he's like, I'm going to spare you the burden of having to deal with all this crap. Just have fun.